Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
And today we're going to be talking about the release of Belonging Again 2.1.
537.
The Belonging Again Part 2, the address,
Yes.
the beginning of it. And so we're happy with the release today.
Yes, so excited.
And we thought we'd talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. I think that, first of all, I'm very excited about the book being out and available for the public, for everybody, and for everyone who listens. So we appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really, to what it is subtitled, right? It is really addressing a very, very much the condition that we all find ourselves in, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, picks up where part 1 left us, saying, okay, well, if we're talking about belonging, which is the idea to, what is belonging? And also, like for most of history, belonging has been a product of sociological givens, thoughtlessness, but of course that runs the risk of the banality of evil, oppression, controlling people, manipulation. And so most belonging has kind of been based on that. Well, that's very problematic. So then people justly oppose those things. But then when you get rid of restraints or givens, then people can be overwhelmed by the existential anxiety of possibility and freedom and choice, which then leads to a whole new set of pathologies. Well, does that mean you're going to go back to belonging based on givens? What would it mean to have belonging again today? And if the sections on the conflict of society and the value circle are correct on the notion in part 1, that, really belonging has always been based on kind of a avoiding seeing vividly the fundamental incompleteness of society. The problem where values can't ground themselves ultimately, and it gets into all the Gödel stuff. Well, then really also when we talk about belonging again today, this arguably is talking about the possibility of belonging in a kind of the real sense in the first time in history, really, which is kind of counterintuitive. But there's a way in which if we're talking about the human actually coming to terms with what the human subject actually is, and what would it mean for the human to operate in a way that's actually fitting for the human being, there's a lot of things that open. And then what would the conditions of society need to be to incubate people that are attuned with how subjectivity is actually structured, to optimize it, to actually see it as a creative opportunity and a source of negentropy or different things like that. And so the book will explore that and why there's ramifications sociologically, economically, in many different things if we start taking that seriously.
Yeah, and I think that the book has this way of really kind of getting into questions that maybe we don't always think about when it comes to when we just on the mainstream or just in our daily lives think about belonging or being situated in our current time. I think today there's the onslaught of that constantly, and also a less justification to maintain or preserve like any type of identification you had or have. There's less there. So I think that thinking about questions that are like that, the focusing on the concept of bestowcentrism, right? This is this idea that you receive predominantly extrinsically or externally what that identity is or what your sense of belonging is, and how there seems to be like this need for a different not simply emphasis, because yes, it is a different emphasis today where we have to learn a little bit more and consider if there's a way to find that sense of what it means to be human without either just absolving all the difference, right, or getting further entrenched.
Sure.
Or kind of unmovable in one's ability to just even have conversation. But I think that situation of considering those things and how our own kind of subjectivity honestly is kind of formulated, and how that changes with this historic moment is really important.
Yeah, I mean, for most of human history, a way that King Laff was saying it the other day, is that how do you get people together when they don't need one another? Like, people don't really need one another in the same way as they did in the past.
Yeah.
You have technology, you have many things. You can entertain yourself with the internet, right? You don't need to see people. And the truth of the matter is, people are difficult. That's kind of the psychoanalytical revelation. We've pretended like people get along, everyone's the same. It's not true. People are difficult. And if you don't need one another, and people are hard, and likewise you don't even have the skills to handle people, you don't have generations, you don't have families, well, then being around people becomes really, really difficult. And the difficulty is even higher when dealing with global pluralism.
Right.
So, we have strategies today of people dealing with it. So the book is asking, how do we deal with global pluralism and it not be a retreat or a surrender or something like that? Actually have a global pluralism of people interacting with one another. And, the book, so this is II.1, and it says in the beginning that it's a continual argument, and we have to release the other books, but it's not in this book, but you have to reflect on someone like Alexander Dugin, who's basically saying nations have different Daseins, is a way to sum it up, and they have their different modes of being, and they have to bifurcate, and that's more of a kind of succession, kind of global succession model. Then you have forms of limited exposure, like a Benedict option, of Robb and Driner, and these notions of pulling back from modern society. You could go all the way to the Amish. Then you have the transhumanist version of saying, well, we're just going to basically figure out how to overcome all determinations biologically, and then we won't have to really worry about the others so much because we can customize ourselves. Or just avoid humanity, or program ourselves to not be existentially overwhelmed by the other person, right? There is also the essential expression of Deleuze. I think Japan is a good example of where westernization without religion leads. All of these are sociological things that are occurring. And all of them, though, are arguably fragile. They could cause things that upset the meta crisis. They could cause war. They could cause collapses of the economy. I mean, you also have issues where it seems like capitalism heads toward a stagnation, as Cohn and Thiel and Keynes talk about. You seem to have capitalism tends to head in the direction of relying on large monopolistic powers, so there's not as much innovation. It seems to become more zero-sum than non-sum. So you have and then if those economic realities are real, and you also have these great difficulties of people interacting, none of these current sociological options, Dugin, Japan, etc., so forth, seem to provide adequate responses to these problems. And you mentioned how in the past, in trade and economics, I know Vivek and Christopher were talking about the Silk Road. I know Barr talks about the Silk Road. We did have times in history where diversity, pluralism tended to occur on trade routes. But the issue is the economics provided a mediating factor. And so I needed to get along with the person who was different from me in order to trade, right? So what do you do? But today, people don't need one another, and they don't necessarily have something to mediate their responses, and then they're incredibly different. And this is really, really hard for the subject to handle, and we don't seem ready for it at all. We don't seem to have any adequate response to this problem that isn't going to risk all sorts of problems, as the book tries to get onto. And then, of course, the biggest problem is, like, we also talk about how there are a lot of gang B or intentional communities that seem to work very well for the people involved, but there's the question of scale. How do you scale a successful community? Because small intentional communities tend to work because they self-select. Not everyone tends to go live in a self-selected community. If you're the kind of person willing to do that, then there's a certain subjectivity you have that is likely to make a community like that work. So you have a problem of scale. But then you say, well, what about decentralization? What if we just kind of decentralize? Well, people have done that throughout history, and it tends to work fine and well enough until one of those communities does an immoral abomination, like slavery, or maybe they eat animals and another community thinks that's murder. Like, it's only a matter of time before the moral real shows up. And once that occurs, people are going to be like, we have to stop it. Well, if you have to stop it, then you need a state, maybe a military, and what Karatani calls the capital nation state comes roaring back. So all of these things suggest a significant problem that is not addressed sociologically. And the argument would be that the address to this sociological problem is also the problem of belonging, for human belonging, because what's happening is it's becoming undeniable that there's a certain problem that has not been addressed or that needs to be thought. And in having the anxiety of that feeling, even if it's just on a subconscious level, that contributes to the feeling of something feeling off. Something is not right, or there's a certain anxiety or tension or pressures that you can't get out of. And all of this is what we would mean when we start talking about belonging. And so, but we also can't be talking about belonging in a naive way, like going back to the little house on the prairie or something like that, because those are the conditions that worked in the past, usually through seclusion or enslaving a minority group or oppression, racism. And that's why it was important for part one of belonging again to end with a notion of the meaning crisis as a sign of hope, because we have to realize we do know how to get meaning. It's like xenophobia, nationalism, war, right? The issue is that we're in a meaning crisis because we're not going to old ways of getting meaning. We're looking for new ways. And that means we're forcing upon ourselves a certain negativity, a certain level of negativity that we're not caving to. But that very negativity is the source of not feeling like you have belonging, which I think is deeper than maybe meaning. And the end of part one says you need both meaning and belonging, because you could find something deeply meaningful, but no one in your community thinks anything of it. And you may not have the money to do the very thing. And in fact, you could find something meaningful, but because you don't have the economic support, that very thing you find meaningful is a torture to you, because you're not able to realize that meaning. So it just depends. There are certainly ways in which the lack of meaning is a major problem. There certainly is something like a meaning crisis going on, along with things like a mental health crisis. But all of this, all of those are maybe not, well, they're not the same as the socioeconomic or the political economy questions that contribute to a lack of belonging.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point about not, people not needing each other, that, from King Lath. And that was a great conversation with you and Joel Creaney and King Lath on elders. I think that it makes me wonder, because the book will really dig deeply into the allegory of the cave from Plato. And there's a way in which, you hear that, like, we don't need each other anymore. And that's, I don't know, the immediate reaction or gut feeling is like, oh, that can't be good, because you kind of forget the other, or you don't have to rely on the other. But at the same time, it's kind of like, well, maybe that's not bad, because then we don't have to impose on the other. We don't have to, we don't have to worry about, can we trust the other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But there does seem to be that the need was a kind of constraint, right? It was a kind of...
It was a kind of given.
Yeah, it's a kind of given, right? Which would kind of give the parameters and the functionality of those relations. And today, what's fascinating about the internet is you can do so much through it and with it, and you can do a lot of good, you can do a lot of bad. But there's something about it that doesn't tell you. Like, we talk about that with technologies, like, or... they don't necessarily tell you. I mean, I want to say it's interesting because, like, one of the basic technologies, and Cadell will talk about this, where it's like the idea that man had the particular categorization of man was that he was a tool man, basically, right? Like he was an animal that could use tools, right? And so, anyways, so basically, like, basic technologies do give a type of, they have a limitation in their very structure, right? Sure. Whereas newer technologies, specifically the internet and cell phones and all of that, it doesn't tell you what is for. It can be for a ton of things. Whereas, like you were saying, the trade routes were for, well, obviously trading and mercantile purposes and exchange, etc. But there's a real sense in which yes, online shopping, there's a whole bunch of things that can be, like, exchanged through the internet, along with relations, conversations, etc. But it's not, it also can do it can also just be there doing none of that functionality as well. It's just there, kind of in your constantly in your face, I want to say, but you could also just put it down or put it away. But it's kind of just even knowing it's there.
Yes.
And there is no need to define or to constrain, to provide that given for the how we should engage then with difference.
Well, I mean, the point that's very important, as you were saying, the loss of the necessity of having to interact with people could open up possibilities of higher quality interaction. Like we were speaking with Guy Senstock about that at the Net the other day, on the idea that we don't need each other anymore, which opens a space for a higher quality interaction, but that higher quality interaction is less probable to occur.
Yeah.
Also, necessity helps mediate relation. Yeah. If I must be around you, then we can always refer to that thing bringing us together to avoid the difficulty of ourselves. Because people tend to be difficult. They tend to have realities. They don't tend to know how to speak to one another. But if we can at least go back to unloading the truck, that functions as a kind of lubricant, a kind of mediation.
Yeah.
And so if you don't need one another, what ends up happening is you have to have self-created, intrinsically motivated reason to interact. Which, of course, how do you have an intrinsic motivation that relates? Because isn't that, by definition, atomistic, kind of separating? So you no longer have an external stimulant or source or of necessity to mediate the relationship, so you have to choose your reason for interacting. But if you're choosing it, how can you be sure they're going to choose it for the same reason? You might choose it for different reasons, causing misunderstanding. And then if you get hurt, which is almost inevitable, then you might feel really hurt and you say, what's even the point? And then you withdraw. Yeah. And if there's nothing forcing you back into a relationship, then you probably won't. Mm-hmm. And so you gradually and slowly get just this natural atomization that occurs. But the very risk of this entire situation that is possible due to the loss of necessity does perhaps open up a new quality of interaction that has not existed in history before. And that quality of interaction could be belonging in the actual real sense that isn't based on givens. It's more difficult to achieve, but in a sense it's the only real possible belonging. Mm-hmm. It's everything before that has actually been just a kind of counterfeit, or counterfeit might be a strong term because the people experienced it as a real belonging, and not everyone in the past who had belonging necessarily did so at the expense of other people. But it certainly was a belonging in the past that tended to operate by restricting freedom or restricting possibility, because it almost has to. Because once you know there are other ways of life, you ask, why am I living the way I am? And that's what creates the anxiety. And you see, that's also the issue with the technology. There's all this technology that you could be using. Mm-hmm. And if you're not, you can wonder, why aren't I? And then also, if you use it X way versus Y way, you can wonder, why did I do it X way versus Y way? And then if you look around and everyone around you is using the technology in different ways, that makes you reflect on your own choices and go, why did I make the choices I did? And the social collective intelligibility gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's the issue, is like the loss of belonging. What's really important is that what we learn from Reif and Hunter and Berger is that the loss of belonging is not necessarily due to the loss of metaphysics or like a worldview, or it's tied strongly to the increase of freedom. It's of possibility is one of the main things that causes anxiety, which, we've just been led to believe that that's not possible, that, increasing freedom is always a good thing. And there's an argument to be said it is, but it comes with the increase of this anxiety, this questioning of why you choose to do X instead of Y. And then if you're choosing to do X, how do you relate to people around you who might be choosing to do Y or Z or A or B? And then how do you even make one another intelligible? And how do you feel like you belong there amidst all those people who think differently? You're spending the entire time trying to not say something that it makes someone mad, or trying to go about your daily life without feeling questioned or feeling like you're doing it wrong. Like, how do you find belonging in that environment?
Yeah, no, that's all really good. I was thinking about, it relates to something I was thinking about earlier today, where I was thinking how it doesn't really, well, technology exacerbates it. It's almost like it's the problem on steroids or something like that. But it's very easy, even just if you block out, the internet just in your head, and just think about how, as humans, we can tend to think about like a space and how, oh, I could be doing that. I could have done this. I should be maybe doing that. Am I whatever it is. Am I using this to the best of my ability or whatever? And in some ways those are good questions. In some ways those are bad questions, in the sense that they can be paralyzing, and then you don't end up doing anything really, or you constantly question every single thing you do, not remembering that, well, it's a process. Maybe you will end up doing that other thing. It just might take a little bit of time. But the at least with the physical space, there's like limitation, right? You've got a couple of, maybe even if you had two handfuls of things you could think of that are sort of potentially looming over you. It's still something to tackle, but that just gets multiplied by, it's like just somebody turned up the volume like crazy on that anxiety with the internet. And I think that I was also thinking about what you said with people not needing each other, with the internet being available. But what's weird is that I don't know how to, if we watch what people tend to do, they still demonstrate a type of behavior or habituation or habit of need. It's like you can't avoid the fact that somehow we are creatures of need, of lack, or whatever you want to call it. And so I was just thinking of this irony, right, where, suddenly we don't need the other, but there's this desperation to sort of make contact with this with this kind of platonic other in the phones, through scrolling through stuff, or just hoping you hear from somebody, or whatever it is, or hoping somebody I think there's a lot of that dynamic that can happen for people sometimes, and it sort of shows that the need's still there. It's just not. It's kind of. It's not. So it's in a way, we don't need each other because of the internet. That's actually that's true in many ways. Yes. But we might need each other in this kind of pathological way, because there's no like actual parameters for what that means. And just to go back to the freedom thing really quick, to be able to belong again is to be able to kind of move through that freedom, and then basically like have to make a certain type of choice that then does limit you, but is still able to put you in a position where you are able to engage with difference. And so what I mean to say is that ultimately we do seem to require some sort of restrictions on our freedom to a degree, right? Like obviously we do need freedom, but if it was just complete freedom, it would be nothing. So but it made me think too about, the allegory of the cave, right? And this idea that we don't need each other anymore. It makes me think of what I feel the book is trying to sort of reveal, where we think to ourselves, well, we don't need each other anymore, because practically speaking, somebody could go and have an internet girlfriend instead of a real human or something like this, okay? But the reality is that we assume that somehow we're like these autonomous sort of able beings, like we came out of the cave ourselves kind of thing. Yes. Right? Yes. But the need for the other would used to, at least practically speaking, reveal that, well, wait a second, maybe we kind of need somebody to take us out. Like, so it's just that there's something there where I think it does, what we're talking about reflects that double nature, or that sort of like misremembering as we talk about, where it's like, oh, we don't need each other anymore because of the internet, or because of the pluralist, this sort of technocratic, technological state. And so then we think that, oh, okay, we've kind of taken care of our own like self-cultivation, and we have it. We just think we have. Yes. So anyways, I just wanted to say that.
Well, the key to what you're saying, the book opens with this like question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave? And turns out in the parable, as came out in a conversation between Jochen and I, is that, the prisoner's dragged out.
Yeah.
He doesn't. We tend to socially remember it as the prisoner leaves on their own. He's enlightened, he or she, and just kind of leaves. But that's not how the story goes. The prisoner is dragged out. And I think the very fact that collectively we tend to misremember it says something about the zeitgeist. But the point is the following. We exist in an age where we don't need one another, but we haven't. So we better know how to leave Plato's Cave on our own, and we don't. Like, we still actually need to be dragged, but we're in an age where we don't need anyone, and there is no one to drag us out because the social conditions are gone.
Everyone's on their phone.
So everyone's on their phone. You know, I love Raymond talking about how the phone is the new cave, the mobile pod.
Oh, I
Note
love
from
that.
the
Yeah,
pod.
yeah. Raymond's stuff's so good on that.
So what has happened is we're now in this very weird, bad contradiction, not a good contradiction, like in the Hegelian sense, a contradiction where we don't need one another. And in order for that, though, not to be a disaster, we need to be able to know how to leave Plato's Cave on our own. And we don't even socially realize we haven't addressed that problem because we kind of remember the allegory as we leave on our own. Yeah. Oh, so we must have figured that out, and so we don't need to think about it.
Yeah.
And so the argument is that this kind of foundational myth of Western society has been misremembered in a manner that is concealed from us, concealed from us by making us think we solved it. Exactly. This problem of how to leave Plato's Cave on your own. And this is massive. Now, again, the book is going to talk on and on about, no one is saying that there aren't random individuals who've somehow, for some reason, learned to leave the cave on their own, or they're Deleuzian individuals, or self-made people, or John Galt, or whatever. That's not the question. The question is, can you socially spread the conditions to increase the probability that the majority of people can leave Plato's Cave on their own? Because if not, well, wait a minute, we just said that we've spread the conditions to everyone of not needing everyone, so we sure as heck better be able to spread the conditions of people leaving the cave on their own. And if not, then we've got a real disaster here, because we've set everyone. There's no way for anyone to leave the cave then, because the only way to leave is to be dragged. And if we don't need anyone, and there is no one, then no one's leaving. All while they think they've left, because it turns out that the shadow's on the wall of an image of a person leaving.
No, yeah, that's good. That's good. It's an important thing that I think the book does, to think to really break down how our minds work in terms of getting us to certain places that then have usually unintended consequences. But it made me think about how it's almost like saying, well, I don't need, I'm not afraid of heights anymore, but they're just like they're going up higher, but they're in like an elevator or a plane or so, something that kind of keeps them from really actually, being on that precipice, or being up doing the climbing and looking down and being like, oh my dear goodness,
Yeah.
So it's because I guess what I'm saying is the idea of it would be different. It's different when somebody says, like, it's like when kids say, right? They're like, I don't need you to do that. Like, they want to do it themselves, when it comes to eating, putting on their shoes or something like this. And there's kind of, I think the constant sort of interaction of human beings in the real, like in the flesh too, sort of reveals how there's this ebb and flow of, I need you, I don't need you, I need you, I don't need you, I need you, I don't need you. Okay? That's just a very normal dialectic of that. Whereas the internet gives this illusion, like, you don't actually need to worry to bother anybody else. You can just entertain yourself, right? Yes. All while you still have that desperate sort of need for the dialectical shared, both need and capability, right? Like the ability that then you get to be in a process with, and sort of exist in that bothness. Well, I don't know if it just comes from like wanting to rid ourselves of that tension of like feeling like a bother if you would rather kind of I don't know, play football outside with your brother than have to just watch a movie or something like that. It's
all about avoiding the real. It's all about the Lacan. I mean, it's on that notion you were saying earlier about there's this way in which, well, in the attentionalism, as Bart says, you need everyone's attention, but just as soon as the real or they become difficult, you want the recognition without the real. Well, this is pathological.
Absolutely.
And also any recognition you get feels fake, or it's fragile, or it feels empty, or one day you wake up and you go, what does it mean? It doesn't. It has a lot of distance, but it doesn't have depth. you in life have to somehow get a balance. You have to get the right fittingness between distance and depth. If you have distance but no depth, you're shallow. But if you have depth and no distance, you've not gone anywhere. So you got to give both. And the problem is, there's a way in which everyone needs everyone else's attention, or they need everyone else's stimulation because they're bored. But do we need one another? Well, that's a whole nother ball game, and that's really difficult. And for most of history, people have only been brought into that kind of relationship beyond their spouses at work. Because, you do need the other person to unload this truck. You do need the other person to do this job. So you're going to have to, even if you're mad at them, figure out how to get along. Even if you disagree with their politics and think they're stupid, you have to get along. So the task, the economy, maybe the religion still do this, and this is another kind of function, is forces you in regular contact with people you disagree with or who are difficult to be around. And if you don't have that forcing function, people just don't do it.
Are you saying that religions would do that?
Yeah, religions would force you to be around people who maybe you didn't like. Because even if they shared your beliefs, they may have different political orientations or different hobbies or different activities, etc., so forth. So we've lost the social structures that in a way force people around one another. You could say school does it, but then here's the problem. You're basically, in my opinion, we've got it exactly backwards. We're throwing like really young children together in these like incredibly intense psychological, war zones, but not adults.
That's a really interesting point. And just reflecting on my own experience with school, I don't know if it's just the fact that everybody's like, we're just here going to school, or we're all students, or something that then makes it like some sort of homogeny, even though...
Yeah, there is still a homogeny. Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Don't get me wrong, especially when kids get a little bit into those young teen years or teen years where there's that sort of more adamant like demonstration of, oh, there's the group of kids who wear capes, and like there's the kids who are really like athletic. You get that kind of self-segregation that people just tend to do, in terms of just finding their, again, it's kind of like they're kind of finding their belonging, right? Like that's what they're trying to do.
That's exactly right.
And I guess I'm just fascinated because, well, first of all, what you ended up talking about was, I mean, maybe they're like, well, it's okay if we do this with kids because they're just going to talk about small potato stuff. They're just going to talk about, like the fact that they didn't get their homework done or like, oh, they've got a crush on the guy in third period or whatever. Like, they're just going to talk about that stuff. So it doesn't really matter that we put them in this kind of crazy, actually quite diverse in the sense that you have people who are all different religions. You've got all, usually, depending on what school you go to, you might go to, private Catholic school, so like you might not have that. But there's this something of like there's something about the school dynamic where, in a sense, to be honest, I don't know that there was ever really rigorous conversation.
No.
Like there may have been conversations about the topic. You could talk about what you were learning, right? All the extraneous conversations were typically like I said, the small potato stuff. I mean, not that it doesn't matter. I'm just saying it's not gonna be like, let's talk about some hot topic, political issue. Now, maybe if you were in a debate society or something, you would, but it would also be buffered by like, we're in a debate society. Like we're given certain things that just to practice debating, we're not like literally having a feud over some political hot button topic or whatever. And it's not the right phrase, but I guess what I mean to say is like, it's weird because in a way you can just get by with it, with, I guess I want to say pluralism, if you just I don't want to say dumb everybody down, but like there's a way in which it's like, let's just keep, because for students, like, yes, we learn a lot of stuff, and yes, there can be like academically rigorous stuff, but in terms of literally Socratic type of dialogue, conversation, that really didn't happen in my school. I don't know if it happened in your school. So it's like, you can kind of basically more or less keep the peace. You get a lot of the like the issues and stress and like the tension in the basically the libidinal stuff that can happen in high school, middle school, high school, and the cliques and all of that. But it's not like over. I mean, yes, the religious difference and stuff can come up. It can come up now and again. And I wonder if it gets nowadays, because it's so different. I mean, it's been a long time since I was in primary, secondary school, but it's like I wonder if today a lot of that stuff gets even more infused in the schools, more and more. We're like the internet and everybody's got a cell phone probably. And so these bigger topic issues kind of get pulled into school. And I'm not sure how kids are handling it these days. But generally speaking, if you just don't have to have robust conversation, you don't really have to worry about it.
I mean, true, and so you're forced to go to school. And also the economic system, it doesn't work.
Well, it doesn't have to work because you're not having to do the work in a sense,
Yeah, I mean, it works because of law and force and expectations in college, and you're not going to get a job, and your parents, and so it doesn't.
Is that like gearing all of the because I'm just wondering, why isn't it that in school you'd get kind of like these more dynamic conversations of difference and even tensions because maybe people haven't learned how to converse. You don't even really get that.
You don't get that from adults. You don't get that from anyone because that would require the whole book is about creating the sociological conditions of increasing the probability of that kind of thing. Like, human beings don't, in place of pluralism, talk about difference. They pretend like they're not different, or they give each other a system or law to force them. Or they just talk
about small potato topics so that it doesn't
because it's too painful to get into anything deep.
Mm-hmm.
Or law. And look, law works, and that's what we've tried to do for the last 40 years with an international order. We're going to hold, or hegemony. Like, you're going to hold the pluralism of the world together because the U.S. and the Navy are going to destroy you if you don't. Likewise, you're going to go to this pluralistic, psychological torture zone that is middle school, or else you go to jail or your parents are in trouble. Like, that works until it doesn't. And then what ends up happening as it falls apart, people tend to hold to the institutions, and that just creates all sorts of problems. But then, of course, people, if they don't like that, would have to be able to handle the alternative, and the alternative would be not relying on bestowing. The book's going to talk about bestocentrism, and, to be draggable means that you have the someone bestow something upon you, mainly draggability or leaving. And so, we don't have, because even when you get to the college level, well, that's self-selection, so it's diverse. No, it's not, because it's self-selected according to the kind of people who go to college and who are interested in those things. And it tends to be relative to zip code. So you could really make a strong argument, in my opinion, that there is, like, nowhere on planet Earth that is in a chosen pluralism. Like, a deep chosen pluralism does not exist. And the closest thing to it are things like middle school or the public school system, which also isn't that pluralistic because they tend to share geography. And this is where we're just seeing all of the problems. We're seeing all the mental illness. We're seeing people feeling like they don't belong. And so then that's just indicative of the larger society that hasn't figured out how to deal with these problems, because you would have to teach different things. You would have to prioritize things other than rationality. You would have to think about the economy not merely as the stimulating demand. You'd have to learn to create demand. You'd have to train subjects to be able to choose difference, to make absolute choices. You would have to, you can't just do diversity because you want to do diversity. You have to create the conditions of possibility where people can handle it, which means facing a whole lot of frickin' negativity. Like, people, if you set them free, they don't just get along. That was kind of the whole, dare I say, neoliberal dream. Like, if we just set all the diverse people free, they'll get along. And getting along meant everyone would look like a Western, like someone from the West, a first world, Western civilization. Turns out culture matters. Turns out people are very different. And so you've got to really focus on the education, political, and economic system of which would make people be able to handle real pluralism, which you could argue has never actually happened in human civilization. It's all been very skin deep. It's all been very shallow. It has not been deep engagement with difference. And now what's happening is that basically all around the world, the inability to deal with deep difference is showing its head. Like, it's coming up, and people are like, oh, no, we're not very good at this. No, we can't handle it.
I mean, you said it's never happened in human history. You mean on a big scale?
Not on a big scale, no.
Yeah, like it can happen in incidences or small
Yeah, but that's what we said. Like, there's been random delusion individuals. There's been random absolute knowers. But I would argue even something like the Silk Road is people mediating through an external object. Like, has people in human history gotten along, chosen to be around one another, and held it regularly without an external mediating object? No, I don't believe so. I don't believe that is something we've seen. It's mostly been through economics, and that's why capital has been so successful. Like, capitalism has basically been the only way we've been able to create a universal language to deal with the problem of pluralism. But then the problem with capitalism is that it condenses people according to the logic of capital. Then they feel flattened. They feel like personifications, as Marx says. Then they feel alienated. And here's the trick. The meaning crisis is just, it's not a mistake. It is a function of capital. It is a function of how we deal with the problem of pluralism. You know, you flatten people, you reduce them to an occupation. Then they'll get along because they have something in common.
Right, and that's like with the student example.
Yes, that's right. You flatten people to being student. We're here for the education. So yeah, the pluralism gets along if you... Reductionism is how you deal with pluralism.
Yeah.
But then reductionism gives you the meaning crisis and nihilism, and then people react against that. So that means you have to figure out how to make pluralism work without reductionism.
Yeah.
And that's a different ballgame.
Yeah. And in that sense, it is more like a truer form of pluralism.
Yes.
Right.
And belonging. Because humans are different. You know, they actually are different. Right. And so belonging that isn't based on true difference is belonging in something that's artificial or contrived or something we've created in order to have that feeling, but it's not based in the reality of people being different.
It's so challenging because I think a lot of, especially institutions, feel like they're, quote unquote, doing their best, you know, to be diverse and have difference and talk and use the language of that.
Yes.
But I think that in a sense that's because it hasn't really... Again, like you already said it, but there's a superficiality to that, because difference would also have to do with difference of thought, not just you know, not simply your ethnicity or your some of the things you can see more on the outside, though those things matter a lot too. But it's like your differentiation of thought, and that's the thing. I mean, I think I didn't mean to harp on the school thing for too long, but it's just there's a way in which. Frankly, the way that it's set up is not really to cultivate like deep thought, but that's why you can't also see the difference. Like it's like, you know, those little Play-Doh tools where you like push it through and it makes a spaghetti. Well, and there's like different shapes, you know, it could be like star-shaped spaghetti, whatever. And so it's like, it's almost like having the Play-Doh there, and school kind of keeps the Play-Doh on the side of that device. Like it doesn't ever really push it to see what comes out and that difference. And so you're kind of kept from that by keeping the kind of curating what are you learning and what can we talk about and all of that. And I'm not saying, like, I guess there are certain ways in which you'll get different opinions, you'll get different expressions, but deep thought is even more than those, I would say.
Well, it's the difference between, like, for Hunter or Berger, all them, they warned that multiculturalism was kind of a counterfeit of diversity, because it's like, yes, people have different cultures and clothing and holidays, but at the end they have a common humanity. And people like Hunter was very concerned about this. He's like, no, diversity is far deeper than just culture and holidays. Like the very ways that people interpret the world, like the very hermeneutics and structures of intelligibility are different. You take that very seriously, then you can't deal with the fact that people are different by saying, yeah, people have different opinions, but at the end, we're all the same. We're all humans. You can't make that appeal. You have to figure out the relation becomes primary, not the common identity. Well, relations are hard. Relations are hard unless they're shallow. And so basically the strategy of dealing with global pluralism has been various making shallow strategies. Capital works. Capital is incredibly effective at this. and we shouldn't bash capital if we don't have an alternative address, so capital does this. The other way that is common and most popular now is the kind of the essential difference of Deleuze, the cheap Deleuze that we talk about, which is the idea that you say, yes, everyone is different and difference is really deep, but it's in the form of an individual expression. And you're trying to make difference as deep as every individual. Everyone is a snowflake, and they become individualist, such as Deleuze puts it, and Bard will talk about. Well, the issue is then you're dealing with the problem of pluralism by completely destroying communal bounds, by intensifying the pluralism to the ultimate point of the individual, which seems like an address, but it creates the meaning crisis, because everyone is an isolated individual that can't intelligibly relate to other people, and as such, then they may just want to escape their humanity entirely in something like transhumanism or different things. So what actually the question is like pluralism is not solved by making everyone so different that they can't relate at all. That's called atomization. That's pluralism to such an intensity that it creates collective atomization, and that's what's going on. So actual and then of course so you've got the capital, you've got cheap Deleuze, as we call it. And then what you're saying with education, that's standardization. So you deal with diversity through standardization. And these are not addresses of pluralism. And then, well, let's put it this way. If you're going to do those strategies, then you better have the social contract to make people feel like they can trust them. Like if they go to school, they'll get a good job. Like if they, if they reduce themselves to working a certain 9 to 5, that they're going to be able to buy a house and have a family, right? If people feel like, yeah, I'm undergoing reductionism, but that's the contract is, if I'm willing to do this, then I'll get kids, a family, a job, some respect, some thymos in the community, and so on and so forth. What has happened now, in the book we'll try to argue, is that the means of creating that reductionism that created the social contract have exhausted themselves. Because because capitalism, based on that, eventually is dependent on stimulating demand, and once it does that, it begins to stagnate, and the cost of living goes up, and so the social contract breaks down. Then, of course, capital and being reductionistic and fungible is the logic of AI that Nick Land talks about. So you're going toward transhumanism on that one. And then Deleuzianism leads to Japan collapsing birth rates and all this, because people can't relate. Of course they can't. They have no shared intelligibility. They're an essential difference. So how do you go on a date? Or in response to Deleuze and transhumanism, you do the Dugan thing and say, well, fine, we're going to bifurcate and try to defend culture, because y'all don't have a culture. You're just capital. You're just a bunch of Wendy's. And so that's what we're seeing. And so, but you see, if you had these reductionists, we dealt with pluralism through means of reductionism, but the social contract was, if you suffer this reductionism, you'll get a family, you'll get meaning, you'll get something. And you may not feel like you have meaning at work, but you'll get the weekends. It felt like a deal to people. It felt like a fair deal. Well, that social contract's gone. And a lot of nations on planet Earth, like Russia or China or some third world, they feel like capitalism's taking advantage of them. So that social contract is broke. And then also people feel like they can't, the generations are not there to support them. So the family structure is broke. That social contract is broke. And then it feels to people that the relations between genders has broke. Those contracts are broke. Every contract is broke. And when every contract is broke, then people get mad, and when they get mad, they tend to do things. And so you have to now, so this basically means you either have to become really forceful with your reductionist strategies. Capital has to become very forceful in the form of AI, or you end up in World War III with a Dugan strategy or whatever. Or you have to take pluralism to the ultimate extreme of the essential difference. So you have to go to extreme strategies. But they tend to fail. They all fail, the book tries to argue. So we need to find a new address. That's the only option. You have to find a new address that is going to allow people to relate and not do so through reductionism, because all the means of helping people relate through reductionism have violated their social contracts and people don't trust them anymore, and so you have all these problems.
Yeah. Do you think reductionism is an aspect of the two extreme approaches that you mentioned, or is it a reaction to the reduction?
I think it depends on which one. In a weird way, cheap delusionism is reductionistic because you're an essential difference, but it's a reductionism in the name of you're gonna find radical meaning as an essential difference because you are expressing that essential difference. Mm-hmm. But of course, I think the truth of the matter is it ends up more of a nihilistic reductionism. Right. Because you don't necessarily find meaning in that, because you yourself become unintelligible to yourself. Yeah. There's a sense in which Duginism is reductionistic because the world turns into nation states or splits apart into nations. Mm-hmm. But in that very reductionism, then you increase the likelihood of conflict or different things. So these things kind of mix together. I would say, ironically, the book's going to try to argue that none of those strategies actually work. They're what people are doing right now, but they all actually still entail a logic of their opposite within them that leads to their undermining. And so the book will try to argue that what we will posit as the new address is actually the only address, because the other options all ultimately undermine themselves. Now that argument has to be made, and no one is saying that the other options do not work for given individuals in given particular circumstances, but they cannot work more collectively in a sustainable fashion.
Yeah, no, that was good. I was wondering then, do you think that the Deleuze individual, it does line up with land, right? Because there feels like something like kind of accelerationist about that. Like just push it to its logic, like cut it to its furthest end in terms of, if we're going to do difference, then we're going to do difference, right? We're going to make it so different we can't even understand each other.
The connection between Deleuze and land is pretty fascinating. Okay. Mikey is very, dangerous maybe. Mikey Downs is excellent on this, on emphasizing the rhizome, the cybernetic. I think there are different ways to take it. You can say that Deleuze is the logic of capitalism as the individual, radical expression to the point where the individual is so individuated that they're a individual, kind of uncollected and yet singular at the same time. And that gets into, I guess, the Spinozan kind of monad that's also not a monad. Monism, this very interesting sort of, and it gets tied into Bergson. And so you can argue that what you have in Deleuze is a logic of capital working through the subject that then actually makes the subject, what I would like to say for the connection is that the subject is weakened from the communal bonds or connections with others needed to stand against capital. Like if we, let's put it this way, if we actually do in some way need one another, but we're not able to get along, then AI is the only thing that's going to be able to solve things, because humans need one another to take care of the world, and if we don't have one another, then only AI can. So there's a way in which Deleuzian is a cheap Deleuzianism, because the book is going to strongly defend costly Deleuzianism. Cheap Deleuzianism leads to a world that really can't stand against AI or capital.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining that. Well, I wanted to say, with like you talking about the needing each other again, I was thinking about that, where there are very fair, critiques of capitalism in its reducing power, right?
Yep.
But it's interesting because you can just call, what's it called, Uber Eats or something like that, like to get a meal, and there's something like wildly convenient about that. And I always loved that play. I know I've said it before. I'm sure I've said it on OG Rose Conversations, but I also said it one time with Caroline Holmes, a lovely poet. We were having a conversation, which is on Spotify and our OG Rose Conversations. Point of the matter is that like we've traded convening for convenience often, and I guess there's just something about this idea of like, and King Laugh brought this up. I don't forget what he was talking about specifically, but he was, unrelated, but he was kind of basically just saying like a lot of these things though, they're there, and they kind of can be marketed to us, etc., etc. But if people didn't like, people get to the place where they like, I'm very interested in this idea of invented need, like, and then this kind of, we don't need, but then we still need, but there's also invented need.
Yes.
Like, you need Uber Eats. And if there was collectively not enough interest in that business, it would go out of business.
Yes.
Like, there wouldn't be a thing, right?
Yes.
It would just sort of fade away. Like, it was just a neat little small business venture, and it just failed.
Yes.
Because people wouldn't want it or need it. But now there's almost this, like, it's funny even saying that, I sort of feel bad, because I'm like, I know there are people who, like, really need to be able to get Uber Eats, because, like, maybe they don't have time to cook.
Yeah,
they don't have family around them. They don't have, like, whatever, the ability, they maybe, So it's just interesting, because I guess what I was trying to say with this, I'm trying to bring out the fact that there's these, like, very fair critiques of capitalism, okay? But when we say this idea of, well, we don't need each other anymore, well, that's kind of like kind of a delusion in a sense, or it's not a delusion, because there's realities. Like I said, you can actually have a cyber girlfriend and not actually, like, worry about, but then it's sort of, are we relying and using and wanting and voting with our dollar for, like, a capitalistic structure such as Uber Eats? I mean, not that that's, like, the epitome of it, but while we say, like, oh, the capitalistic structure is, like, bad and making us do all this stuff, well, it's a little bit of both.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the problem. I mean, starting with the cave, is the idea that we're in this ambiguous space where we simultaneously believe you need to have a teacher, but then you're your own rugged individual. Like, people can leave the cave on their own, but then they need a teacher to tell them how to leave the cave on their own. What's going on? Like, it's this big mix. I mean, the key is that as we've become in a state where we don't need anyone, we need people more than ever.
Exactly. You used to just need your grandma to make you some dumplings. Now you need, like, 7 people at least who are at that shop running it, basically, to get
Well, this is where the book, so it gets into disablement with Ivan Illich. Like, this world in which we don't need anyone is the world where we're the most disabled. I mean, the book is going to argue...
Yes, exactly,
The book argues in many different ways that we've arrived in these logical contradictions. Like, they're not... They're all contradictions now. They're Hegelian in the sense that they create a tension that has the possibility of a negation sublation. Yes. But as we try to say in the absolute choice, contradiction, I do think it's a mistake not that Hegel thinks this, contradiction does not necessarily lead to negation sublation. It could lead to effacement, self-effacement. I mean, that's the absolute choice. That's where the choice is a big thing. So what you have now is the reason why belonging is such a problem is because of all of these various contradictions. So, for example, we don't need anyone, and yet we're more disabled than ever. We have we have a really strong economy while we have wages collapsing. We have technology that is making life so easy while mental health is going through, like, collapsing.
Exactly.
Right? Like, there's structural. Cadell calls his book, the great book, Systems and Subjects. And it would be a mistake to say it's all the system's fault, and it's a mistake to say it's all the subject's fault, because it's a interconnected feedback loop between them. But this interconnected feedback loop, because we have not addressed the question of how does anyone leave Plato's Cave on their own, you've ended up in these sociological structures that are all contradictive. And the contradiction is just coming out, and as it comes out, it leads to blow up. It leads to disaster, because we haven't dealt with these problems. And you see the book, and so disablement is a big deal. So when we say we don't need one another, it's paradoxically while we're the most disabled we've ever been.
1000%. Yeah.
As we talk about thinking for yourself and being your own individual, we rely on bestocentrism more than ever before, right? I mean, as we say rationality, think, we are also using the cell phone to look up every question known to man, and we're stuck in small talk, right? These are all the kind of glimmers of the overall sociological situation that are suggesting that there is something in the structure of society that are leading to these contradictions. And it is not merely a result of, say, beliefs or, like in individual metaphysics or something like that, although those things matter,
right.
there is something going on that is leading to these very bizarre contradictions that in humans living amongst are then being eaten, they're feeling very anxious because, there's contradictions.
Right.
So no, I mean the book. So if the book chapter 1 is how does anyone leave Plato's Cave on their own? Mm-hmm. It will also then talk about Nietzsche and bestocentrism,
yes.
which is based on the philosophy portal. We gave a presentation at the conference. Then also out of a voicecraft session, how do we assure everyone is... Well, then this came out of the Justin Murphy from a point, on how do we make sure everyone is persuadable without totalitarianism. And Plato basically starts Republic, and he's like, if people choose not to be persuadable, there's nothing you can do. So how do we make sure people are always persuadable? Because once they choose not to be, it's too late. Mm-hmm. It's a very serious problem that kind of helps justify some of the heavy-handedness of the Republic. Then out of the voicecraft session, how does anyone come to understand that it really matters to understand what really matters? And, as you can see, every section is kind of trying to build up on the last section that are under these different themes. Then the next chapter of the book, Neurodiversity, Simone Weil, and Nash Equilibria. Because basically, if you're in Plato's Cave by yourself and no one comes for you, that's a Nash Equilibria. Because you would never think to leave the cave on your own. So how would you? Well, you would have to think differently. You'd have to be neurodiverse. Mm-hmm. So the conditions of society that... basically, just on that, all of the contradictions we're talking about, being extremely disabled when you don't need anyone, that's a product of a Nash Equilibria. That's where everyone did what was rational and got a suboptimal result. So autonomous rationality is not the way. You need to introduce a different way of thinking. Chapter 3 is going to, the plan of affliction, preparation for the singularity. Here we talk about, some of Cadel's works on the cosmic evolutionary philosophy and dialectic approach to technological singularity. We must unplan our lives. We talked about that at Parallaxed. We have pluralism, the essential limits of mind, and the affliction of globalization. Affliction is a Simone Weil term. And I definitely think that as you approach the singularity, there is a way in which the subject fractures off into smaller and smaller essential differences. So how you need to have more sophisticated means of making people relatable and intelligible to one another. Chapter 4 is, on thinking Gödel's incompleteness with, there's a section here on the Gödel point, the nihilism of Stanley Rosen, that Guy Sinstock got me on. I know Viveki likes that. Then we talk about systems and subjects by Cadell last. And that would be, coming to terms with childhood. The next book is called The Problem of Scale. And I think The Problem of Scale is the problem. Yeah. It is the problem. And I could read off all the different sections, but if anyone's interested, hopefully you can find the table of contents on Amazon. But basically, the problem of scale is going to be the question of how do you spread the conditions by which more and more average people, more and more people would be not merely rational, but mentally divergent, able to think according to AB logic, not just AA logic. Because AB logic is going to be the necessary way of thinking to help avoid these Nash equilibria.
Well, I think, just hearing some of the chapter titles, I think, persuasion is persuasion or persuadability, which I think is a really great term that the book will use, is really important because it kind of feels like, well, what does that have to do with belonging and difference and diversity and the subject as but it's everything because it in a way to be able to have the ability to live amongst others, right? There will be times of I want to say kind of maybe kind of compromises or
sure.
ways in which you have to work together.
Yes.
And unless you've got persuadability, which is something that one actually has to learn to cultivate themselves a lot through suspension of judgment,
Absolutely.
being able to dwell with different thoughts for a sustained amount of time. Without that, it just literally it usually just comes down to force,
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that it's interesting because societies do end up educating people and cultivating certain dynamics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even within let's just say a kind of homogenous society, I'm just saying, like, just pick a type of society that, like, most people are all more or less metaphysically aligned or whatever. You're still gonna need persuadability, and because the thing is that I was thinking about this when just meditating on the book, where difference is, I mean, it's always there. It's always there. It's just that we're kind of what I mean to say is that you can get even just a family, and you'll get massive amounts of difference even between people, and so persuadability is essential. Like, it's an essential ability to cultivate in order to really do pluralism actually or fully, and in that manner also do belonging, right? Like, to be able to cultivate the ability to belong.
Well, I mean, if being persuadable sends a signal that you're open to the other. If the people around you are not persuadable, or they don't,
and not just a symbol, but like an atmospheric.
It affects
right?
the atmosphere
it does.
radically. And also, persuadability is an ability. It's a skill. Like, we think about persuasion or being persuadable as a weakness. That means you don't fully believe things. But actually, the ability to hold yourself as a clearing, to hold within you conflicting ideas and to weigh them and then make a decision, is a skill. Yeah. And so, we don't teach persuadability. We give people positions and have them memorize, but we don't teach people to do the psychoanalytical work where they have the ability to be persuadable. And if they're not persuadable, then they're not going to send signals to the other that they're open to them. And so people lack the ability to be around one another as difference. Yeah. And so, like, that's just one example of if you took that seriously, you'd have a different education. Yeah. You would teach differently. And
yeah, absolutely.
Because you would create different and that would create different associations of what you should learn and what you shouldn't learn. Right. Like, what is an educated person? Right now we think an educated person defends a position. As opposed to what if an educated person was someone of whom was able to make themselves a clearing that was able to hold different positions that they could weigh and then judge on. Yeah. This would be mentally divergent. This would be a different way of thinking. This would not merely be more rational. This would be a different way of thinking. And at the root of avoiding many Nash equilibria is a different way of thinking. And if we do not do this, and the book has to go on and on about different topics of what this would look like in different areas, and the West book on scale, we'll talk about time, energy, Dave, a lot on Illich, Keynes, how I don't think in economics we know what demand is. We haven't talked about demand. Internal coordination, Adam Smith, Karatani, Nick Lang, different, Alex. We talk about Alex and Andrew's book on story and theme. All of these are going to stem from a realization that we have to transform what people associate as doing a good job in being a human being. People have to have different associations on what that means, and until that happens, there's no possibility of belonging.
I think too, I was thinking a little bit about just, as the book will get into, with this idea that we think we are, we think we are persuadable when we think we're teachable, but we're really, it's different. And it's different because that ability to have persuadability, I think there's almost something artful about that.
Yes.
But we haven't necessarily recognized that as a necessary art to cultivate. Or that it's even needed, that it's even needed. Maybe this gets tucked under, but we don't need it anymore.
Well, there's a sense in which it wasn't needed, or at least it wasn't needed where you could, quote unquote, get by, not knowing it under givens or similarity. Well, but now under global pluralism, it's not acceptable.
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right. But I also think about the long form debates of early American presidents or something like this, where
sure.
There seemed to be at least an air of more of this ability.
Maybe. I mean,
maybe
certainly,
not. I mean, it's certainly, like, I guess as the book will get into, I mean, if it's within your ideology, that's not necessarily the same as persuasion.
Being persuadable within Christianity to take different positions about the Eucharist is not the same as being persuadable regarding entire worldviews or entire economic models or entire ways of doing society or entire ways of, eating or diet or things like that. So, you're right. I mean, but there's also the demand of persuadability today is quite high.
That's fair. I think that's fair, and I think that's true. Because even if you have what feels to be a very stark difference, right? So you get one man over here believes in a federal bank, and then the other person doesn't. They don't think that should be centralized. So that to me feels a more kind of more weighty than just sort of some doctrinal. I mean, doctrinal interpretation is pretty heavy too. Can be pretty heavy too. But it's like these are very different views on things, and I do think that maybe there was actually more long form suspension of judgment and conversation, but at the same time it was far more limited, and also was like kind of delegated to those who had to be representative for their people.
Yes. It wasn't necessarily.
It wasn't just like
public.
the average layman who had to do this. Now it is.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. To be able to kind of hold that suspension of judgment and to interact. I mean, right now, another way to put it is education is about technical essence, technical mastery, careerism. This would suggest education as the suspension of judgment, the ability to hold and see through ideas, certainly creativity, the child of Nietzsche, the ability to judge things as noble for yourself, not just good as given you from the external. But all these things are connected, and the book has to go through all of these different things. And for more, please check out the Amazon page where you can get Belonging Again II.1. There's also a conversation on the book with Cadell on the book that we highly suggest that will be coming out next week from when this is published. So that will give you more analysis of the text. And please do pick up a copy today. You can get it both in Kindle and paperback.
Yes, so thank you. And again, we're very excited about Belonging Again II.1 being out to the world. And thank you all for your support, and thank you for your time.
Absolutely.